Well, as I said, welcome to creating an outstanding proposal, the narrative section. It's great to have you here today. We have a lot to cover in this workshop, which is really all about how you're translating your idea into a proposal. This is a critical idea to keep in mind as you're creating your proposal and developing your project first and creating your proposal afterward, is to keep in mind that these are project grants here that we offer at NJCH. That these are not general operating support grants. We can't just sort of unilaterally support the work that you are doing generally in your organization. We are actually categorically forbidden from doing that by our funder, the National Endowment for the Humanities. What we're looking for is a clear project with a clear plan, or in the case of an incubation grant, possibly developing a clear plan. I think another important idea to keep in mind that's going to kind of undergird all that we're talking about here is that a good idea is a good starting place, but it's not enough to create a successful proposal, to necessarily create a successful proposal, a successful grant proposal. At present, about 30 to 40% of our applications are funded in most rounds. We just get way more applications than we're able to fund. We always run out of good projects to fund we always run out of money before we run out of good projects to fund. Therefore, it is critically important that your idea, this great idea that you have, is translated into a clear proposal that can be evaluated by our external evaluators to be both practical and possible. That's really what we're looking for. And that's what we're going to help you develop through this workshop. We have worksheets that'll be available to you for both creating your narrative and your budget. We will both send them out to everybody who's registered along with the recording of this workshop, and we'll post them on our website too, in case they are useful to you. They're not required, but they may be useful. So this is our agenda for today. These are the main topics that we're going to be talking about: pre-application, what makes a competitive project, the review criteria that are used for all of our evaluations, some main reasons why proposals are not funded, and we're going to take a look at a sample project through the process. Before I get started, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or use the raise hand feature or put something in the chat, whatever works well for you. Yeah, we'll keep on moving. So I'm calling this section pre-application because it's sort of everything we want to think about before you even actually turn to the application itself, to the actual narrative in our application system. There are multiple parts to your application. There's the project narrative. That's a lot of the time that we're going to be spending today. There are support materials. The support materials that I'm talking about are the optional support materials. This is an area where if you have additional information that would be helpful to evaluators understanding your project, and that could be anything from a letter of support from a scholar or community member or organization that is involved in your project, to a scope of work or an estimate from an external consultant. It can really be anything. That is another section of the application. Those are optional. There's your project budget. And again, in part 2 of this workshop, we'll be doing a really deep dive into that part. And then there's all your organizational information, which includes your organizational budget, FTEs, which is full-time equivalents, how many people work in or volunteer for your organization, your UEI, your unique entity identifier, your financial materials. These are all the different parts of your application that are available that you will have to fill out as you're filling out your application for funding. Before you start your narrative, we strongly recommend that you make sure that you have all of the materials you're going to need. And of course, ask questions if you're uncertain what something is, if you're missing something, you need an alternative, etc. Some people, for example, do not have a 990 or have only the 990N, which is just a postcard that really doesn't tell you very much at all. We're happy to accept an alternate form of financial documentation. We just need to chat about that very briefly through email or on the phone before you submit. Additionally, as you're thinking about your application and preparing your project, there are some questions that you can begin to answer, whether it means answering them on paper or just kind of answering them in your mind. These are the questions we've outlined to help you get started. These are all versions of the questions that are going to exist inside the narrative. So really, if you're not able to answer these questions, not quite ready to answer these questions, it's going to be really hard for you to create a complete narrative. These questions include, who is this project for, right? Who is your audience for this project? How are they involved in the development or implementation of your project? What is the problem or need that's being addressed? How do you know that it's a problem or a need that's being addressed by your project? Why is your organization the one to do this work? In other words, how does this connect to your broader work? What will you have in the end? And what steps will you take to get to those products, whatever those products are that you're going to have at the end of your grant project? And finally, what does success look like for you? So all of these questions are just kind of contextualizing what you're going to need to tell us as part of your narrative. Does anyone have any questions at this moment before I move into what's going to make a competitive project that's able to answer these questions? Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, for the project I'm developing with a visiting scholar and the community components, we already have like emails. Yes, we're joining, from several communities, people. I'm just wondering how formal. I mean, I can go back to them and say, look, I need a really formal letter, or is the email sufficient? Or
absolutely. Unlike a lot of funders, we're relatively light on formality. We'd like to not make additional work for you or your program partners. So we'd much rather work with what you have than require you to provide something else. The only thing I would say is if there's inappropriate language or information that you don't want us to see within that, please do plan on blocking it out.
Right. No, I'll download it. No, there's not inappropriate language. Sometimes it's just very casual language, like, yes, of course. It's like, yes, of course.
That's totally reasonable. Yes, right, exactly. If it's comprehensible, it's great for us. If it's not comprehensible, then actually it might be worth it to spend an extra few minutes making something a little more formal. Great question. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but if there are questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll take these periodic breaks. Okay. When we're thinking about projects, one of the big questions that everybody asks us is what is going to actually be competitive, right? And we know that our applications are competitive. 30 to 40% funding means that 60 to 70% are not funded. So we want to make your projects as competitive as possible. It's critically important for me to offer a very big caveat, however, as we begin talking about the competitiveness of your projects, which is that I can't tell you exactly what's going to be competitive. It's different in every round. I can tell you that you should never try to do something that you don't want to do. The project has to make sense for you more than it has to make sense for us, in fact. But there are some basic pieces that kind of come together to make a really competitive project that is ready for a strong funding application. Obviously, I hope this is obvious. You have read, understood, and follow the guidelines that are required through the grant application. I do remember it was a number of years ago, but we had an application form, and I think it was a couple of days after the application deadline. So we're already past the time when you can apply. I got an application letter from an organization that hadn't looked at any of the materials, but had spent all this time developing this very long letter that was totally inadmissible as an application. So following the guidelines really becomes very, very important. Not the age, but again, if you're looking at other funding, understanding what the priorities of the funder are and evaluating if your project is a good match is really important. For us, expanding access and participation in the humanities, particularly to individuals or organizations that have not traditionally been very involved in the humanities is a significant, of significant importance. Helping to create more diverse organizations and even leadership within those organizations is a big priority for us. And focusing our work upon historically excluded voices and communities is really foundational to a strong and competitive proposal that's going to come from NJCH. A competitive project has a clear project description. This is what I refer to as the what. What are you doing? It seems fairly obvious, and yet this is often something that is lacking. People give us a lot of reasons why their work is very important and why the audience that they're reaching out to is very important, but lack detail on what they're actually going to do. The sort of over-the-top example of this is, if you're working on improving, access to literature in your community, or maybe access to literature by writers of color, that's fantastic. But I hope you're doing that through reading groups or book giveaways or things like that, and not through, saying, oh, we're going to take everybody to Great Adventure. What you're doing becomes very important, at least as important, if not more important, than why you're doing it. But still, we can't leave out the why. The value to your audience, what I refer to as the why part one, right? Who is it for and why do they care? Becomes a huge part of talking about the value of your project to its intended audience. And then, of course, there's the value to your organization and the value that your organization brings. This is what I call the why part two, like why you. Another way of thinking about these two ways of exploring those why questions are, why are you doing this, right? Why are you doing this project? And why are you doing this? Why are you the person, the organization, the group to make a difference in this particular way? So that's getting us through some of the main ideas we want to have as far as creating a competitive project that's going to align well with New Jersey Council for the Humanities. We're going to next get into a little bit more specificity about how your projects are actually reviewed. Since the review criteria ultimately is what our evaluators are using to consider your applications and using as their rubric for whether or not your application is successful. I'm doing okay? Any questions right at this moment before I move on to review criteria? Okay. Keep them coming. Okay. So I want to say before we get started in the actual criteria themselves, that our applications, all of the applications that come to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities are reviewed by a committee of evaluators who are your peers. They are humanities professionals who work in humanities-based organizations like libraries, museums, other types of cultural nonprofit organizations, neighborhood and community groups. And they are, of course, scholars within humanities disciplines. So usually coming out of colleges and universities across the state of New Jersey and representing a wide variety of disciplines in the humanities: history, literature, philosophy, various studies of many different kinds. I always often say we are humanities people. We are the studies people. We're the interdisciplinary people. And there are 4 main criteria that those evaluators use in their assessment of each of our proposals: project plan and outcomes, humanities content and project team, audience and outreach, and budgeted capacity. The application is roughly laid out into these same kind of sections. The narrative part of the application is roughly laid out into these sections. And I do have to say, since this is a question that comes up often, yes, there is overlap between them. I'm not sure how we could that this is where you are describing your project and telling us what you hope to create from it. right? What is the plan for doing the thing, and what is the thing that you're doing? Under this, as we're thinking about what's going to really be strong in this area, is a clear delineation between incubation grants and action grants. Incubation grants are about planning and development of projects. Action grants are about implementation of projects. Invariably, there is always a little bit of overlap between these things. There's always planning to be done as you're implementing. Absolutely, I recognize that. But your project is ultimately going to fit more solidly into one or the other. If most of the funding that you're requesting is about planning and development, you're probably in incubation grant territory, even if you are going to be doing something at the end of it. If most of the funding that you're creating, however, is about actually doing that thing that you're creating, right? It's about putting on a program, or it's about developing a resource or whatever it is, that is probably in action grant territory. If you're not sure, please do talk to us about it. It's a good idea to have one of our offered grant consultations sooner rather than later. I can also say this is one of the main things that we look for when we're evaluating LOIs. Sometimes we look at this and we'll actually follow up with folks because we'll say, you know, it's kind of sounding actually, I know you've submitted an LOI for an incubation grant, but I think this might be an action grant. And we do have the possibility of switching you into a different category. But it's best if we try to do that. If you're really not sure, it's best if we try to do that as early as possible. Having a realistic and well-conceived plan. This is so fundamental to the evaluation of proposals that I'd say it's sort of the central part of it. Again, this is getting back into what I was talking about before, right? That the what is really important. What are you doing? And does it seem like you can really do it? Is that really possible? Having a clear timeline for what you're going to do, and the deliverables, and an articulation of what you're going to have, the deliverables or the outcomes that you're going to have at the end, even if that those deliverables are only the plan. Like in an incubation grant, often you're creating a plan, at the end you'll have the plan. That's your deliverable. That's totally reasonable. Regarding the timeline, for all of our grants, you have up to 12 months to complete your project. You need to begin that period within your project within 3 months of award. So in this case, because our awards will be given by the end of December, your project needs to begin between January 1st and March 30th. You determine your project period beyond that. So starting between January 1st and March 30th, whatever your start date is, you have up to 12 months. Your projects can be shorter. That is reasonable. And then assessment. I want to be very clear that assessment does not necessarily mean that you have a very formal evaluation with an external evaluator or anything like that associated with it. You are most welcome to include those in your application, absolutely. We've even had applications that are entirely about evaluation, which is great. However, even if you don't have a very formal assessment associated with your project, we still are very interested in how you're going to know if your project is a success. What are the indicators that are going to point to your own success? How are those connected to your project's goals? Defining what you wish to measure at this stage is much more important than talking about the methodology. So what we're not terribly interested, it doesn't really matter necessarily at this moment, whether you're going to do a survey or a focus group, or you're going to look at people's responses in some particular way. What we are interested in is what you're interested in looking at, whatever methodology you end up using. Going back to those sort of ideas that I was talking about a few minutes ago about what makes a competitive project, all of what we're talking about here is very much in that definition about why are you doing this, right? What is the this? What is the thing that's there? Before we move on to our next criteria, I wanted to take a moment to drink water and also see if anybody has questions about project plan. Now. Okay. And we can come back for questions as well afterward. So our next criteria, humanities content and project team, excuse me. Centering humanities topics and practices is obviously incredibly important from us here at the Council for the Humanities. We are a humanities council. Humanities being central within the project is really foundational. This is one of the main areas when applications are not successful. It's hard to identify what the humanities topics are within the project, or the humanities are just kind of tacked on at the end and not really central to the work of the project. This happens a lot, honestly, in arts-based projects. Your project, a strong project, will pursue complex questions and ideas. It will have opportunities for active learning and engagement, right? Not just in necessarily passive learning and engagement, which is kind of what we're dealing with right at this moment, to be honest. And you will have a well-rounded and experienced project team that is well suited to the project. We previously, if any of you may have looked at NJCH grants in the past, we had a very specific requirement for the inclusion of a humanities scholar. We have moved away from that, not because we devalue humanities scholars, quite the opposite, but because we recognize that often it's not just one scholar who's going to make a well-rounded project team. We want to know, excuse me, what expertise you have within, what expertise you might be bringing from without, and how that all comes together into a strong team. You do not necessarily, when you're talking about your project team, need to talk about every single person who might be involved in a tangential way. We're talking about the people who are core to the work that you're doing. That is your project team. And of course, your project team is thinking always about your audience. So the most successful applications will have a clearly identified and specific audience. I mentioned specificity because a lot of people like to talk about their audience as being the general public. I know all of us hope to have the general public involved. I'm very glad always to hear that the public is involved because our projects are very much, our applications are very much focused on public humanities, not academic humanities or individual research projects. But talking about the general public is very rarely helpful when thinking about a grant project. Often, if you are attempting to make a project that is for everyone, what ends up happening is it ends up being not specific to anyone at all. If it is for everyone, it ends up being for no one. Specificity actually helps people see themselves in your project. It is entirely possible that your project may have more than one priority audience. For example, you may be looking to involve a particular group of people in your community, and then secondarily, you may be looking at a different group of people in your community. That is totally reasonable, but clarifying and articulating where your priorities are is very, very helpful and will make your project more competitive. Project co-designed with the audience. That sounds so fancy, but we really don't mean it in a fancy way. It is a good strategy to think about how you can build something with your audience rather than just for it. Understanding what your community's needs and interests are is foundational to creating projects that they are going to feel a need for and an interest in. If they help build it, they are much more likely to come. If they have a role in helping to implement it, they are much more likely to come. And they are much more likely to tell all of their friends and family that they should come to. They become your cheerleaders. And it helps you understand what the specific needs of that specific audience are, specific needs and interests, I should say, of that specific audience are. As I mentioned, NJCH particularly centers work that focuses on underrepresented or marginalized people, as well as untold stories, sort of two sides of a similar coin. We know that there are a lot of people who are very deeply engaged in the humanities, and we know there are a lot of people who are not. Similarly, we know there are a lot of great narratives about the humanities that involve the humanities that leave out a lot of people who were clearly present at these times in history, or at these in these spaces that are so important to us, that are part of our values and a part of our culture. We are really looking for applications that uplift and pull people in from those margins. And you are able to, oh, I should mention before I move on, as far as serving underrepresented or marginalized audiences and telling untold stories, the application really relies on you to define who those people are in your communities. There are a lot of different types of marginalization. There are a lot of untold stories, more untold than told. Helping us to understand who those people are within your own community and why you're doing this work with that community, with those people in your community, is very helpful in us understanding the particular need that you have. And finally, in sort of this area of audience outreach, you can identify clear strategies for connecting with this audience. If you don't yet have a connection, it might be that that is something that you are trying to build. We see this a lot in incubation grants. That is totally permissible. However, helping us to understand why you're going to reach out to them, who they are, and how you might have any type of even tangential connection is critically important. Without having any idea about connecting to that audience, that becomes an indicator that your project may not be practical or possible. So helping us to understand what your connections are to this community are really important to make your proposal competitive. That's what the evaluators are going to be assessing. I'm going to pause one more time as we're stopping here at audience and outreach, and actually humanities content as well. Any questions? Nancy, go ahead.
Here's our seminar today. The applications are due like in 2.5 weeks, right? Give or take, right? Or even sooner, right? October 17th. Am I right about that?
October 17th, yes.
Right. So that's, not tons of time. So I guess what I'm asking is how to indicate in the narrative that one has community partners, but the processes of building up, as you said, working with are, they're not completely defined yet, because the project in our case is going to happen in March. So, I mean, one doesn't want to pretend, but on the other hand, it's sort of a process of working with new community partners. So what's the best way to indicate that we're sensitive to that, but it's not like there's a set plan yet for all those components?
That's a great question. You don't want to lie. Absolutely not. That will not benefit you at all.
Lying is not, we don't like liars.
No, it's just really not going to work out in the end. So there's a few different ways to approach this. Tell us where you're at right now, right? Let's say you say, we have already reached out to these people, right? Or these organizations or these communities. It's going to depend on your project. You had already asked a question about, sending along their interest, right? A letter of commitment tells us that that's one step more. That's one step more possible, right? They said yes. It's not like you say, oh, I reached out to them, and then we find out right a month after we gave you your grant, they said, absolutely not, how dare you, right? So that helps us understand. We certainly don't expect all of your, especially in an incubation grant, but even in an action grant, every single I is not going to be dotted, every single T is not going to be crossed. That is what you need your grant funding for. That's totally fine. But remember how I was talking about a clear plan and a project team that makes sense, right? If you are started down that way, if we can see that that is how you are working, chances are you can build upon that work. Similarly, another approach to this is to show us how you've done this in the past, or to show us about the existing relationships that you have now. Again, depending on your specific project, and we can always talk about this in an individual basis in a one-on-one grant consultation. It's going to vary, but those are some strategies for how you're going to begin to articulate this. Tell us where you're at right now. Tell us where you hope to get to and how you're going to do it. Even saying, one of the things that I used to say when we had the one single humanities scholar, where are you at with your humanities scholar? Have you reached out to them? That's one step, right? Next step, have they said yes? 2, 3, have you articulated, a contract? If we get this funding, yes, I will do it. Or if you don't have that, if you haven't identified a person, do you know what kind of person you're looking for? Have you sent out 3 emails and you're just to 3 different people and you're just waiting to hear back? Telling us where you're at in this process helps us to understand how possible it is. Or is this really at this moment a dream and you're not quite there yet, and maybe you need to delay your application to the spring, for example, or to next year, or whenever it's going to make sense for you? Does that help to answer your question a little bit? Great, thank you. More questions?
Hello, Gigi, this is Terry.
Hi, Terry.
I'm sitting in for one of my co-volunteers. We work with a foundation through a church that does historical and a lot of other activities for the community. And this is brand new to us, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I just needed some clarification. The difference between an incubation grant or us considering trying to get funding for programs that we already do that deal with the humanities.
Yeah, incubation grant is probably, if you're looking to continue projects that you already do, you're probably looking at an action grant.
Okay.
But the difference, is planning and development. An incubation grant is a planning grant. An action grant is a doing grant.
Okay, so should I take that to say that if we're having some conceptual ideas of things that we would like to do in this area, that would fall into the incubation process? And what's kind of covered? I apologize again, I don't have the guidelines here. I'm just sitting in.
No, that's okay. It's totally fine. This is really foundational and sometimes difficult. It may be worth it. We offer one-on-one consultations. Might be worth it for you to sign up for one. Number one, so we can talk about it specifically, but also it is the other piece of this that I can offer to you is look at what you need funding to do. Like, what's the actual money going to pay for? If the money is paying for conceptualization and planning, that's an incubation grant. If the money is primarily paying for the doing, right? You're going to hire a speaker, you're going to have an exhibition, whatever, then it's doing, then it's action.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sure, no problem. I am mindful suddenly that usual I'm going too slowly, and I should through a little bit more, and then we'll take some questions right afterward. Okay. Budget and capacity is the final area for evaluation, and this is what we're going to be going into much more in the budget workshop. But your budget matching your narrative is a really big part of this, helping us to understand why you as an organization are doing this project is really foundational to those questions around budget and capacity. There are some main areas for why we see proposals not getting funded, and these relate to everything we've been talking about so far. So main reasons why proposals are not funded. It may be one of these reasons, it may be it's often a combination of these reasons. The project lacks a central humanities focus. It is very unlikely to be funded. We are the Council for the Humanities. If the project plan is unclear or vague, unlikely to be funded, no matter how good the idea is. If you cannot define your audience, and especially if your audience lacks a public focus, unlikely to be funded. And then, as I mentioned before, the most competitive proposals are ones that really involve audience members or their representatives in their conceptualization and implementation, whether at the grant stage or possibly before. Sometimes they've already been involved and now you're doing a different thing. And of course, not matching NJCH's funding priorities are very big. I want to mention one more thing here. Sometimes these problems come from the project design. So the actual project is just not well aligned or is lacking a particular area. And sometimes the problem is the proposal itself. One of the things we're always looking at as evaluators, and we're always trying to help our evaluators through, is this a really, really great project that maybe is not articulated as well as it could be? And sometimes the opposite as well. Is this a beautifully written proposal that actually doesn't have much sort of real stuff underneath it? But I'm gonna stop talking for a moment, and Basil, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. We applied to incubation grant in this cycle. So I was wondering if the action grant has to be the continuation of the project in the incubation, or can it be an independent project, different project?
Yeah, we don't have a requirement that you have to get an incubation grant before you can get an action grant. We don't have a requirement that you have to apply to us with the same thing ever. So if you have a project that right at this moment you are looking for planning and development funding, you can, strange. And then at another time, you wish to get funding for something entirely different, that's totally and completely reasonable.
Thank you.
That makes sense? Cool. Sure. So I had hoped to take some time to look at this particular sample project. We're running out of time. So I'm gonna only briefly talk about this and then send out some more information about it. In 2021, the Roebling Museum in Roebling, Burlington County, applied for a project called To Be Good Neighbors. This is actually directly from their application. The community had urged them to preserve a house across from the actual main museum site, which is a factory in a former company town, the Roebling factory. So it's an authentic example of a 20th century industrial immigrant workforce house. So they really wanted to, before they started work on this house, wanted to be able to work closely with the community to figure out what that would mean, right? What does it mean to preserve this? What does the community even think about that? How can we create connection and growth within the community? So they developed a project plan to do that work. They were going to research community engagement practices, develop a new strategy for community engagement to gather community feedback about this opportunity, go out there, get out there in the community, synthesize their findings, and then create a plan from this. I think I've probably said enough about researching and developing and getting out into the community and learning. I think it will not surprise you to hear that this was, in fact, an incubation grant. And, oh, sorry, didn't mean to quite do that yet. Just sort of looking back through some of those review criteria that we were talking about. Why was this proposal successful? What were some of the hallmarks of what made this? Why did they get the funding when other organizations didn't? They were clearly an incubation grant. They articulated how this was about planning and development. And in fact, as they did their work, they sort of moved in slightly different directions than what they were doing, which is totally normal. What they had initially planned on doing, which is totally normal. They had a clearly identified deliverable, right? They're going to create a plan. At the end of this, they're going to have a plan for what they're going to do. And they've articulated why this project is meaningful to themselves and to the community, right? Why are you doing this? They have this house. They want to know what the community thinks they should do with it. The humanities content was really solid in this project. A community engaged history project. The humanities practice, this like bringing people together to discuss is very much deeply rooted in humanities practice. The project team was really strong. Their executive director is a labor historian. This is kind of her area. But she also brought in consultants from outside who had, between the two of them, decades of experience in public history and historical preservation, and specifically in looking at historic houses, which this was, who were also deeply invested in community engaged public history, in the practices that they wanted to do. They had already spent some time developing the relationship with the community and understanding why the community cared about this. The community was the one actually who pushed them toward this project. So they were able to really articulate what the community need was and interest was in this particular project. And focusing the project around gathering community input provides a clear strategy for identifying and engaging with their audiences. It was an interesting mix also of history, of connecting history to the present, right? How are people going to care about this piece of the past today? And within their budget, which we'll look at later, they really articulated, they really asked for the right stuff to support that narrative. And it was directly connected to the mission of the organization. We're going to actually talk about this example more in our budget workshop. But before we move on to that section, I wanted to remind everybody about the important dates coming up. We offer draft review. If you would like to submit a draft of your project for review, you need to submit it by October 11th so that we can quickly read it, get comments back to you. If you can submit it before then, I highly recommend doing so. And you are welcome to submit a partial draft, by the way. Grant consultation, one-on-one, so that we can talk to you. I will get right to you, Nancy, one moment. Grant consultation one-on-one is something you can schedule. The scheduling link should be in your LOI acceptance. And if you can't find it, please email us at grants@njhumanities.org and we will send it right back to you. The deadline for your final applications is October 17th at 11:59 p.m. My wish for you is that you are not still doing your proposal at 11:55 p.m., but I will have no judgment of you if you are. I was preparing this slideshow last night pretty late. And you will be notified of your whether or not you have received an award, and we notify either way by December 31st, but really almost definitely by the week before that, because we're hoping to have it all wrapped up before we take our holiday break. I'm going to stop sharing and turn my attention back to all of you. Questions. Nancy, you mentioned that you have a question.
I have two very quick questions. I know you said we can submit a draft review, so I have to believe you. You're not lying. So there's no what's the word I want to use? It's not you know, in academic life, it's the idea that you ask for that kind of help is so strange, and that you would be seen as somehow weak for doing that. So you're saying, no, it's fine, do it.
Strongly recommend, especially as a new applicant. If you are a new applicant, strongly recommend. And a partial draft can get us a long way.
Good. And the second thing is, I just want to I absolutely, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm taking a lot of oxygen here. I want to make sure that I can join the budget, and I'm not sure I initially signed up. So is there a new link for that? What's the way to do it, or should I just stay on?
No, we're actually going to a different spot, but I'm going to put the link in the chat. Give me 2 seconds. And while I'm putting the link in the chat, does anybody else have any questions? I don't think we have any questions in the chat. Very silly not having my link ready to go. Apologies. Oh, Sylvester put the link in the chat. That's why he's the best. Thank you very much. In all seriousness, thank you, Sylvester. So if you want to join us for the budget question, I will gladly do that. And we actually have to wrap up this meeting so that we can start the next one. Still working out this whole, timing and Zoom stuff, but are there any other questions before we hop into Budget World? Did everybody get the Zoom link if you don't already have it? I hope so. Great. Well, we're here. grants@njhumanities.org comes to both me and Sylvester. So you should not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Also, if we've got a quick question and you just want to give us a call, please do. The only issue is that we are, often in meetings. So we'll get back to you as quickly as we can, promise. Email is sometimes faster. And I'll see you in the budget workshop shortly.
I
Go
just
ahead,
want to
Terry.
say thank you. You've given me some good foundational information to do some research with, and we will probably be following up after the new year with you. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Very helpful.
That sounds wonderful. All right, I'll see you all in the budget workshop or at another time.